Janine Kakmar with the Palos Heights Public Library.
And I'm Gareth Blakeslee from Lake Catherine Nature Center Botanic Gardens.
And today we're bringing you a new show called Nature by the Book, right?
Yeah.
The library in Lake Catherine actually did a program at the library with the same title, and it's a program about, it's a nature-based book panel discussion about a book relating to nature, the issues about nature, the influences of that book. And so that's what we want to bring to you today, a show where we talk about a book on nature. So, Gareth, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about The Invention of Nature. It's a book about Alexander von Humboldt by a lady named Andrea Wolf.
And okay, so two names I'm not recognized before. Alexander von Humboldt and Andrea Wolf.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the author first.
Well, Andrea Wolf, she's actually not a scientist, but she I think went to design school. She was born in New Delhi. She was raised in Germany, and then she is actually British though, with all that background. But she's written a number of other books like Chasing Venus, and she's done a number of articles also for like different newspapers as well. And then I think she became fascinated by Alexander von Humboldt because I think he was somewhat forgotten in history books, so to speak.
Right. When we did this program before, I had never heard of Alexander von Humboldt. He was like the most important person I've never heard of. He, at one point, so we're talking about, he was born in 1769, so we're talking that time period. His name was second only in popularity to Napoleon.
Right.
He's had over his lifetime mountains and rivers and lakes and glaciers named after him, Humboldt.
I think that was the traces that you would see of his name was in those names that you would see around the world, but no one really specifically was talking about him per se. And I think that's why Andrea Wolf got very fascinated with him and his influences, because they're manifest.
Right. So she says, you know, she felt the same way. Why has nobody still talking about him nowadays? So she came up with this book. But he, I mean, even Humboldt Park in Chicago was named after him. And I kind of laughed when I learned that the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt.
Right.
I mean, he was this hugely popular guy, but today he's mostly unheard of. Right. So what do we know about? What did you learn about him?
Well, it was interesting because this book really, I mean, I've been familiar with the name Humboldt for years. As a biologist background, he's probably one of the more animals are named after him than virtually any other person in the world. So
really?
It's one of those kind of crazy facts that they're like, yeah, you hear the Humboldt penguin, obviously the Humboldt current, which obviously is the current of South America, but a whole bunch of other things like squid and all a variety of things are named after him as well. No one else has that honor. But I think what's interesting is realizing how much of an impact he had on other people and other scientists that we know today. Okay. You know, people like Darwin, people like Muir. We may not know or may not have known Humboldt personally, but we've known his work through other people throughout my life and a lot of other people's lives.
Right. So let's go back to his beginning. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So tell us a little bit about how did he become this person who's, you know, such an incredible, what we call a polymath, or somebody who studies a little bit of everything. Can you tell us a little bit about his upbringing? Well,
you know, I think he was raised in Berlin, and he had a number of other, he came into a lot of money when he was younger. I think his parents died quite young, and all that money went to him. I believe he was kind of working with Goethe a little bit, who wrote Faust. So I think he was always around intellects, academics, and I think he was always fascinated with the natural world. And I think he came across different things. It was like he realized there was this expedition that was potentially to go out to South America, and he was still very, very young at the time, and he used almost all the money that he came into to help fund that trip to overseas.
So this is the big trip, probably the defining moment in his life, early life, basically. This is somebody, he was from a fairly well-off family. He had this insatiable curiosity to keep learning. So he decides to go to Latin America, which at the time in 1799, this is when he did this trip, the world basically knew nothing about that part of the world. Right?
Yeah, the first explorers have gone over there, but there was not much else. I mean,
No
you had a lot
maps or anything?
We had probably very rudimentary maps, but like places that he was going to weren't investigated in the same way as other people, other parts of the world. There were still big empty spots on the map, so to speak, and he was able to start filling in some of those blanks.
So he sets off on this trip, which was about, it took him 5 years. Okay, not to get there, but while he was there, it took a long time because he was carrying like what 85 different instruments. I mean, he was going to go and just calculate and record everything of his trip. So, what was the significance of his trip, the different areas he went to?
Well, I think the defining moment of his trip, they claim, is when he was going up Chimborazo, which at the time they thought was the highest mountain on Earth.
So what is Chimborazo, for those who don't know?
It's a volcano, probably in what they call present-day Ecuador.
Okay.
It's about 20,000 feet high.
20,000
yeah.
feet.
So it's about 8,000 off the actual highest mountain in the world,
Wow.
Everest. And he decided to, he'd been obviously exploring the area, he'd been going up the Orinoco, he'd come up with a number of things, but he had a moment, I don't believe he quite made the summit, but he was up there with, basically not modern gear.
Yeah, no, they're wearing what, wool coats and nothing like the kind of clothing we have nowadays.
And trying to take equipment with them at the same time as well to measure things. And the equipment obviously isn't lightweight, it's made of metal and boxes and all that kind of thing.
Right.
But on this mountain Chimborazo, he almost had a defining moment of realizing how the interconnectedness of the world, and that was the idea that almost has shaped everything. So that was the first time that anyone had come up with the idea of an ecological, interconnected Earth. That systems around.
What revealed that to him?
It's probably a number of different things, and we always say there's a defining moment, but I think there's a defining moment when the spark of the idea, and I'm sure later on is when the ideas really started to coalesce. It's the same with Darwin. When he came back is when the ideas really coalesced into a thing. But because he was such a good generalist and because he was a polymath, he was able to see the world probably differently than a lot of other people, and I think seeing how the mountain, where you have ice at the top, you have different types of vegetation at a certain level, have another different vegetation lower, then you usually go down to trees and then a tropical rainforest.
Right, because he started there. He started in the rain, in the river and the rainforests, and then he started moving his way up.
Seeing those zones and then seeing how those zones also compare to things around the world, even though they might be different species, he noticed there was a similarity in all these different things. He was a very good pattern finder, and probably because he was such a generalist scientist and interested in lots of different things is why he was able to do that. From that trip, he was able to come up with the what they call the nature gemalt, which is what we take for granted and we see all the time, that zoning of different mountains. And then he was also able to apply that for around the world, where you have different ecological types around the world. So you've got jungle here, you've got jungle in other tropical places, you have tundra up north. No one had really come up with those very key defining pattern ideas, even though those species may vary. So having that idea was huge, and it sort of started changing from. I believe Carl Linnaeus was at the time talking about how different species were very kind of stuck in their way.
Right. I was wondering what was the trend or the thought before he came along?
Well, certainly that everything was kind of set in its way. That a species was a species and doesn't change. That's Almighty, so to speak, put them on this planet, and nothing really happened. They were there by God's grace, if you like. Okay. And that was Linnaeus's view, and they were very much into classification of this time. But what the reality of it, and the genius of thinking about how different species vary around the world, that it's a fluid. So it was almost like pre-Darwinian ideas of evolution. Evolution was an idea that was coming around, but the actual process for it hadn't been discovered yet. So these ideas were very kind of common and were starting to be discussed, and that's also part of what's being brought into the ecological idea of what's happening in the world.
Right. So he writes a book about his 5-year adventure, which one of his best qualities about it, the author talked about, was that it's able to relate to people of all classes and all ages. The farmers, the craftsmen, the schoolboys, the teachers, musicians, artists, politicians. They were all able to read his findings and and give them a greater understanding of the world that they lived in,
Right.
which had elevated him into a status of celebrity that was not really, it was saved mostly for like royalty or
Right.
something. He was, people loved the idea of, everything's connected, everything's interconnected, it's a web of life, humans as well.
Yeah.
When he talked about, part of the book we talked about when he was in Cuba, and he was on the plantations, the sugar plantations. First of all, slavery, he was, he not only did he study nature, he's also studied humans and
Our impacts on each other and the impacts on the planet.
Exactly, and what type of, the sugarcane farms, the kind of thing where they're, what's the word when you're just, knocking all the trees down?
Yes, clear cut and all that.
Clear cutting,
yes.
they're clear cutting land to
Monocultures that they were developing.
and his observations of Cuba back then when it was all sugar plantations is that this country is going to be dependent on one thing, and what happens if something happens to that crop.
And he noticed those sort of similarities in Venezuela as well, where there was a lot of clear cutting for monoculture, like taking away of the tropical rainforest. And like some of those ideas even today is like when you start removing those tropical rainforests, the rainforest maintains its own biodiversity. It maintains its own climate by creating moisture in the air. It's a cooling effect. And obviously now with those kind of ideas of like you can actually affect the planet, affect the climate, are now coming to play even more readily now in the news. With,
and that was back in 1804 or 1810 or something.
But even the bad effects of over-irrigating places.
Right.
I think people think, how's over-irrigation causing issues? Well, it kind of drains out all the nutrients from an area that normally wouldn't be growing this kind of thing. And if an area was tropical rainforest before, you clear cut that all the nutrients in a rainforest are held in the trees. All the everything else is held together by the roots. So if you take the nutrients, if you take the trees, you're taking the nutrients out of the system for that particular type of ecotype. So I don't know if he understood that, but he knew what the outcome was when you did do those sort of things.
Yeah.
And I think those were things that, like in his personal narratives, which was the book that he wrote at that time, people hadn't really been thinking about that kind of stuff. So he touched on a number of different things. He talked about the interconnectedness. He talked about the ideas of like how slavery is bad. He talks about how our weather patterns being affected. So all these kind of things. I mean, he talked about. I mean, I don't think he came up with the idea of what his later book was going to be was the cosmos at that time. But he was certainly kind of coalescing those personal ideas into something interesting.
He continued to learn. So after he did his 5-year trip to Latin America, he ends up coming up to Washington. He sails up to the United States. Jefferson is president at that time, of course, and he had just made the Louisiana Purchase. So he was very curious. Jefferson was very curious, and the government was very curious on where the division line between the Spanish colonies and this new land that they acquired was. And they didn't even know for sure. They didn't know where that Texas border was, well, it became Texas eventually. Right. They weren't sure. But Humboldt did know because he spent so much time with in South America. He knew people who had made the delineations, and so when he came to Washington, he was highly sought after, for many reasons. Jefferson had just sent Lewis and Clark off to explore the Louisiana Purchase, so Jefferson is a person who wanted to know about new worlds, and so he was very...
Because even then, Jefferson didn't know about the interior of his own country. They didn't know if there was...
He didn't know what he bought.
No. They had no idea if there was volcanoes in the middle, if there was woolly mammoths still. There was no idea.
A lot of rumors.
A lot of rumors about what could be there.
Yeah.
And that's what I think part of the genius of someone like Humboldt is that he filled in the gaps and he started to make those connections. And I think speaking to another person like Jefferson, who was also quite a good amateur scientist himself, and his agricultural ideas as well was quite interesting.
Right. He and they disagreed greatly on the slavery issue. And he was disappointed. Humboldt was disappointed to see that Jefferson, had over 200 slaves on his plantation or his estate, but they clearly shared other ideas through that. But Humboldt continued to learn, and he was the kind of guy who he wouldn't take someone's word for it. He would be the guy who went out and he would be like a Lewis and Clark. He would be the one. You have new land. I'm going to go out and see for myself what this. I want to see what the vegetation is. I want to see what the air, the waters taste like. He was all in.
Well, that was the thing about him. He wasn't in his ivory tower. He was a scientist that wanted to get out there. But because of his interest in creation, he's probably one of the last great polymaths. Someone who's actually diverse in their knowledge about different things.
Spoke several languages, fluently, easily changed from one German, French, Spanish to another.
He lived in Paris for a while when he was back in the day, but I think that was more typical for educated Europeans at the time as well.
Right. He said the reason he settled in Paris was because they were studying science like nobody else was at that time. Then he goes to Russia, Siberia. What do you remember about that trip other than anthrax?
Well,
that's all I could remember.
I think it was paid for by the Tsar at the time, and they really were just looking for like minerals. It was mostly. I think Humboldt was disappointed with that trip because he was looking to investigate what was going on in the world, but really it's kind of a way that he only got the backing for that because they were looking for mineral rights,
gold or silver, or something, right?
So I think there was always that kind of challenge of trying to meet in two different needs. I think with his original trip, it was his trip, it was his money. This had to be funded by someone else.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's always a difference when you have someone kind of thing coming back. So I think that was always a disappointing trip for him. Yeah. Because he wanted to go to the Himalayas eventually, I think, and he never made it there.
Could you imagine?
No.
Yeah. So he did say, like, even when he was always a little bit discouraged by people who are saying, with all the explorations, did you find gold or silver, And he's like, even when he was in the United States, he said, why are you asking me about silver or gold when you have treasures in your land? Every season you turn an abundance of crops and you turn the soil over and you have this incredible wealth of food and crops that you can to feed your country. That's your treasure. I mean, that's how he thought of the world like that, There
was a point later on when Darwin read his personal narrative and went out to the Galapagos, but he got to meet him later in life. And he was a little bit disappointed with his meeting, but there's a point, because he wanted to ask him about a specific point in his book in Russia. And it was there was a river, and on one side, Humboldt said, it seemed like it was European species of plants. And on the other side, it seemed like more Asian species. So this was really tying into some of the ideas. And Darwin was like, okay, because he'd been exploring the ideas, he'd already gone to the Galapagos Islands at this point, he'd already kind of come up with some of these ideas. He'd already written a pretty popular book about the HMS Beagle, which he went on, which actually a lot of people quoted was very, very similar to Humboldt's personal narratives as well. Okay. So he was really kind of interested that even Humboldt at the time had come up with the ideas like, this looks different to this. That's interesting. Why is that? And why is this river the defining line?
Yeah.
And then obviously, of course, that was something that Darwin expanded on later. And Darwin arguably would never have gone on his own trip if it hadn't been for the personal narratives and Humboldt's original things.
Right. So you talk about his influence. I mean, this man, he was answer 5,000 letters a month. People just were dying to know more about him, and he was keen on answering all of them himself. He did not have a personal secretary. He wanted to make sure he was speaking directly to whoever asked him questions. But he as he got older, he continued to write his books. He had 5 volumes of Cosmos. And he was like 87 years old or 89 when he passed, right?
I think he just kept working all the time. I think he kept doing reincarnations of Cosmos or different versions of it. And the Cosmos was really his most significant book because that was based off all his lectures. So the personal narratives was different, but the Cosmos was really the ideas and that was based off his lectures he'd been doing in Berlin. And obviously he was never happy, so he was always refining that thing and turned it into. I don't think he actually even properly finished it, possibly, if I remember correctly.
I know he got to volume 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were worried because he had a bit of a stroke when he was 2 years before that, but he continued, to work. I mean, this is a person who was so famous. Like on the anniversary of his birth, which was 1869. Celebrations rang out worldwide in the Western world. In the United States, tens of thousands of people would celebrate in the streets for this man. And then, so why is it that we've not heard of him?
Well, certainly in English-speaking countries, a little thing called the First World War came across, and I think there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, which at the time very understandable. A lot of books were burned. A lot of books that were German in origin were gotten rid of. They were gotten rid from libraries. Even our royal family at the time has a name like Saxe-Coburg, and they changed their name to Windsor to sound more British. So there was definitely, people were very
distancing themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're all related anyway, so it's not surprising. But yeah, there really was a push away from being fond of Germans. So I think that, plus the Second World War as well, really kind of put the nail in the coffin on, even though obviously Humboldt was way before those the First and the Second World War. He really didn't have anything to do with it, or died way before then. But still, there was that anti-German sentiment, so that meant everything. So,
didn't also science change a bit as well? They started to go to more of a specific field of study?
Well, I mean, that's one of the things, is like, back in the day, you had people, certainly who people had money, they were able to be educated in lots of different things and had lots of different interests. But there was definitely more refining aspects. I mean, right now, he was a geographer, he was a biologist, he was a nature writer, he was a poet. You know, you don't get that kind of combination of people nowadays. He's a great generalist. Everyone now in the science field has almost to be very specific. A chemist is a chemist, and probably a chemist in a certain aspect of things. A biologist is probably a biologist in a very specific aspect. They've honed in on that. That changed, and you almost had to really delve into the details of things. So I think that kind of changed. Like, there's probably never going to be someone like him again. But you know, maybe we do need a few more generous scientists as well. But he was a genius of his type. So a couple of things were happening. Anti-German sentiment. Although his name's still very popular in Latin-speaking countries. I'm sure if you went to Venezuela, you see his name around, and also obviously in German-speaking countries, his name was not forgotten. It's mostly just the English-speaking world that he was kind of forgotten, and purposely.
Yeah. So what was your, I don't want to say your favorite part, or what was the biggest thing you got out of this book?
I think the impact on other people. The fact that he had such a... Because there's lots of explorers back in the day, and they did interesting things, but the ideas he came out with and how they influenced other people. You got influence on Darwin, which shaped everything we know about everything. You've got Muir, the existentialists were impacted by him.
Thoreau.
Right, they were all impacted by him. So all these different things, and even our just general view that we just take for granted of the world, of how it's all interconnected, we don't necessarily attribute that to him, but it's in every day. Even the nature Gamal, the drawing that he came up with, that's in every book that you ever learn, from geography to everything. That kind of idea of zoning. I mean, those impacts are huge. He was so good at making patterns. He was the person who came up with isotherms as an idea. We had different weather patterns and different temperature gradients. So no one else had done that before.
That's amazing. And I know he's another comparison. They say he's like the Shakespeare of his time. You know, so can you imagine when you're during Shakespeare's time, when you've never seen the movie, or excuse me, not the movie, the play, the story of Romeo and Juliet, something like that, where it's like so new and different. It's like it changes the world. Yeah, you know, it's everything. You know, so same kind of something like him as well, where you talked about what the isotherms you said. Those are terms, or the web of life. I mean, that's something that we all have grown up with, and as we all know it. So in a way, we've kind of known Humboldt, but we didn't know that we did know him.
Absolutely.
We've known what he's done, but we didn't realize it came from him.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating.
And also, the nice thing about this book as well is it turns out to actually be a really good read as well.
Yeah.
Some books are very rich. This is a very rich book, and it's interesting all the way, because it's a mixture of adventure, a mixture of science. You come away learning from stuff. I know from a few years from now, I'll probably say something and I don't know where I learned that. But it's probably from a book like that. And it's a good read. It's a good read.
It's like thanks to the author who wasn't a scientist, per se, who can take a look at something and explain it in everyday terms and make it an intriguing story. His life was worthy of a book. I mean, he was absolutely fascinating. I myself am not a science person, and that's the reason why we have this program, because we wanted to combine, books in nature and science and that kind of thing, in English, that kind of thing. That's why we had that panel.
Right.
And we did have some wonderful discussions. But, you know, to bring somebody like this person to everyday people, and to show the significance of what they did, that's what I find as like the rich nugget in here.
And I also think is the things that he was talking about back then. And we're talking about 1799.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And there's still the same issues that we're dealing with today to a greater or lesser extent. He was almost been prophesizing outcomes of what humans can actually do to the planet, and usually it's sometimes somewhat negative. But you know, he was one of the few people who was actually talking about that. So he was breaking the mold for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So he was. The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, is the book we were talking about. What do you think? What do you want to leave with anybody who's curious about this book? What do you think? What do you want to say to them, Gareth?
I think it's one of those books that if you've got any kind of natural curiosity about the world, this is a great book because you'll learn stuff. It looks like quite a tome. I think it's 400 pages or something like that.
It is 400 pages.
And that can be a little intimidating to people, but you'll get so much out of it. It's a really good read. There are some books like this that you talk about. It's less of a biography and more kind of a discussion of his life and his impact, which I think is a little bit different because it talks about all the other people that were impacted. So almost half the book is about him, and then half the book is about his influence, and for all the other different characters.
Yeah, and the characters in the book are big names: Jefferson, Napoleon, Simon Boulevard from Venezuela. You know, several other major politicians at the time, other kings and czars, and that kind of thing. Yeah, he had led a rich life.
Yes.
You talk about the book is thick, but this much of it are her notes.
Yeah. So, which means it's well researched.
Yeah, well researched. But it's an easy read. Yeah, I think it's something. You know, if I was to say, someone asked, "Would you want to read this book?" You know, if you want to learn something new about a fascinating person, and I always find it interesting when you read somebody who lived back. You know, so we're talking 1800. How they did what they did with what they had.
Yeah.
None of the current luxuries that we have with equipment, computers, clothing, shoes, just to walk up the mountains in those probably hard leather shoes. I don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
And then his travels in the Amazon when he was being, you know, poisonous arrows were flying past him. And
well, it's as much an adventure story as anything else.
It is an adventure story, yeah.
And it's nice that as you as a non-scientist obviously got a lot out of the book as well. Yeah. I mean, sometimes those different types of books, you know, they may not appeal. So you can say someone like you and someone like me can also enjoy the same book about it.
That's right. All right. So there you have it. The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World. Gareth, any last comments or anything?
No, I think we've covered a lot here. I think it's good. Yeah.
So again, thanks for being here with us, and I'm glad we were able to bring this program to you guys out there. So we look forward to seeing you again.